Welcome to this explainer. When we think of the Roman Empire, we usually picture the grand marble monuments, the sweeping political sagas, or the massive legions. But today, we're going to step away from all that. We're going to reconstruct a far more visceral reality, everyday travel. We're diving into the past to see it as a living, breathing civilization, uncovering the sensory, logistical, and, honestly, often dangerous reality of the ancient road. We'll discover how ordinary people experienced hope, fear, hardship, and survival simply by stepping outside their city walls. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of Roman infrastructure, we really have to pause and strip away our modern assumptions. Today, distance is just a minor inconvenience, right? You hop on a plane or a train. But what did it actually mean to cross a sprawling empire at the speed of a horse? Or, well, more likely, on the soles of your own feet? Surviving a journey in the ancient Mediterranean required immense physical and psychological resilience. It meant placing yourself at the absolute mercy of the elements, a rigid social hierarchy, and the ever-present shadow of violence. So let's dive right into part one, the arteries of the empire. We have to start with the physical foundations that bound the whole empire together. The legendary Roman roads and bridges weren't just nice pathways for civilians. They were literally physical manifestations of imperial control, carved straight into the landscape. These arteries were designed primarily as military fortifications for rapid deployment. In fact, the Latin phrase for building a road, viam muninae, translates literally to building a fortification. By weaponizing the structural arch, redirecting the weight into compression rather than relying on fragile straight beams, Roman engineers could throw durable stone bridges across unpredictable rivers. They were basically forcing the geography of the Mediterranean to submit to the geometry of Rome. And to keep that uncompromising ruler-straight trajectory, those engineers favored directness over natural topography. They would drive their roads straight through hills and lay heavy causeways right over marshes. In mountain passes, they accepted grueling uphill gradients of up to 20%, just 20%. Imagine the raw sensory grit of that experience for a second. The straining muscles of draft animals, the sharp crack of whips, the agonizing groan of heavy wooden axles, all of it demanded by the state's absolute insistence on the shortest possible route between 2 points. Moving on to part two, the burden of state transit. Okay, we need to completely deconstruct a modern myth here. The Roman cursus publicus was absolutely not some friendly public post office. It was actually a heavy, extractive burden placed squarely on the shoulders of provincial taxpayers. Maintained through forced obligations known as liturgies, local populations were legally required to supply the animals, the wagons, the fodder, and the labor. It was an infrastructure designed purely to secure state communication and transport government agents, at the direct expense of the locals. And this setup perfectly highlights the stark societal divide of the ancient world. If you were a state official, you carried an imperial diploma. That was a passport issued by the emperor, granting you the right to requisition all this transport. But the ordinary civilian? You were completely locked out. You had to rely entirely on private means. That meant hiring your own weary mules, trudging through the dust on foot, or tapping into whatever fragile personal networks you had just to find a safe place to sleep. Modern academic scholarship actually reveals an incredible truth about Roman administration in this regard. The state didn't employ a massive, centralized fleet of government postal couriers like we might imagine. Instead, they just maintained the rigid physical infrastructure, the way stations, and the requisitioned animals. Authorized officials and military agents then exploited these resources as they moved along the routes, so the crippling labor fell on the everyday locals, while the benefit went strictly to the empire. Data compiled by the Stanford Orbis model shows us exactly how this played out. The speed of your journey was dictated entirely by your social status. Time and distance were literally experienced differently depending on who you were. With access to swift imperial horse relays, tremendous ground could be covered. But if you were a merchant hauling bulk goods, you were relegated to the creeping, agonizing pace of an ox cart, moving maybe 15 to 30 kilometers during a grueling, sun-baked day of travel. Which brings us to part three, sanctuaries along the way. You see, understanding the spatial rhythm of a journey is absolutely crucial when travel is this physically exhausting. For the elite traveler, the road offered a predictable, highly controlled sanctuary. Every 25 to 30 kilometers, which is roughly a standard day's travel, the state constructed menciones. These were substantial imperial ends. They offered baths, warm dining, fresh relay horses, and military protection. But again, you could only cross that threshold if you held the emperor's diploma. But what if you were just an everyday person? Well, barred from the mansiones, you had to brave the capone, the private roadside inns. Archaeological and literary evidence paints these places as gritty, smoke-filled, and incredibly disreputable. You'd walk into a room thick with the smell of cheap wine and unwashed bodies, notoriously frequented by thieves. It offered a highly dangerous night's rest. You practically slept with one eye open, acutely aware that whatever modest wealth you carried was a huge temptation to the strangers breathing in the dark right next to you. Let's step off those dusty stones for part 4, navigating rivers and seas.
Because overland bulk transport was just prohibitively expensive. I mean, you had to feed all those draft animals. Ordinary merchants relied heavily on the empire's waterways. It was cheaper, sure, but highly unpredictable. On rivers like the Tiber, flat-bottomed barges moved massive quantities of grain and oil. But sailing against winding currents was often impossible. Instead, these heavy barges were laboriously towed upstream by teams of men or oxen, trudging through the mud of designated towpaths right along the riverbanks.
Out on the open ocean, though, the sea dictated its own absolute laws. The Romans actually recognized a legally and culturally defined season called mare clausum, or the closed sea. From mid-November to mid-March, savage winter storms and unpredictable winds made Mediterranean navigation a virtual death sentence. This officially recognized closure is a profound reminder that ancient empires, despite all their structural arches and incredible engineering brilliance, were ultimately forced to bow to the natural environment. Finally, we have to confront part 5, the perils of ancient travel. We really can't ignore the omnipresent shadow of violence. The Pax Roma might have been a political reality on a grand scale, but it shouldn't guarantee your personal safety on a lonely stretch of road. The Roman satirist Juvenal vividly captures the anxiety of the era, famously writing that it was irresponsible to leave your home at night without first drawing up your will. And while he was writing satire, the underlying fear was completely genuine. State police forces, as we know them today, simply did not exist. You joined large groups, you armed your servants if you had them, and you prayed to the gods for safe passage. And the raw archaeological evidence absolutely cements this terrifying reality. All across the empire, historians have uncovered the tombstones of ordinary people, merchants, young travelers, entire families, bearing the chilling inscription, Inter fectus a latronibus, killed by bandits. The rural highways, the deep shadows of the forests, and those steep mountain passes where heavy wagons slowed to a vulnerable crawl, they were prime hunting grounds for violent outlaws who were often driven by extreme poverty or military desertion. Actually, if you managed to avoid bandits on land, the seas offered the looming threat of piracy. In the ancient world, piracy wasn't just some minor nuisance. It was a highly organized, devastating force. As the historian Velleius Paterculus noted, they operated with entire fleets, plundering coastal cities and terrifying the Mediterranean in a manner that literally rivaled formal warfare. A traveler on a merchant vessel had to accept the very real risk of being slaughtered or sold into slavery if their ship happened to be intercepted. So as we wrap up this explainer, it becomes pretty clear that surviving a journey in the ancient world was not some romantic adventure. It was an exhausting, deeply unequal, and dangerous endeavor that exposed the raw realities of Roman life. I want to leave you with this provocation. How does understanding this sensory grit and massive structural inequality change your view of Rome? In a world where every single mile was measured in sweat, exorbitant cost, and mortal risk, the act of simply arriving safely was a triumph. Keep that in mind the next time you take a journey.